Welcome back. In the previous video, we wrote our first PowerShell function. And in this case, it was a function to send a file to a remote computer or destination folder on a remote computer. Now, this works great, but let's say I want to run this, right? What if somebody runs this? Can you think of what will happen if I do this? So let me run this. And there you go. What it says is, well, I cannot validate the argument computer name because there isn't. It's null. This new PS session does not accept a null computer name. It needs a computer name in there to function. So how can we handle that? Well, the param block has another keyword we can use, which is parameter. And here you put in parentheses and you add attributes to that parameter. And one of them is mandatory equals true. Of course, it only makes sense to use mandatory equals true because mandatory equals false is the default. So now let's run this again. Let's see what happens. And now you can see it's asking me to supply a value for computer name. Because it is mandatory, I don't have a choice. I have to put something in there. All right, so let's just say test. And there we go. So now there was a problem connecting to computer test. Now, of course, we also want the file to be mandatory and the destination folder to be mandatory. We can't just run this command without all of this, otherwise it doesn't make sense. So let's just do this, right? And now we are forced to run with all three of those. So let's run this. And now we can say test, test, test. So there you go. Now it's asking me about all these attributes, these parameters, sorry, that I have to have. Now there's a few more things here. If you look at advanced functions in PowerShell, you will see a lot more information about parameters. So if you have questions about parameters, you can look here. Now another one we may want to use in here is validation, because we do want to validate that our parameter meets a certain set of criteria. So for example here, null, see allow null. Here we had a string typecast for all of these, but that didn't really work with what I wanted to show you next. So let's say we want to make this mandatory, and let's just keep that, right? So let's do file like this. Now it will have a problem because it is an empty string. Because it's typecasted to be a string, an empty string is not allowed. It has to be more than just an empty string. But what happens when I do destination folder and I put it in an empty string? Well, okay, 1 second. Let me do this test. See, it doesn't complain. See, it has no problem with destination folder being an empty string. So how do we make it so that destination folder will actually work properly if we don't typecast it? Well, here we can use validate not null or empty. So when we run this, again, exactly the same code, it will now have a problem with destination folder being an empty string. It will validate that destination folder is not null or empty. and it will return an error if it is, right? So now we can do the same thing for computer name. So we'll do test here and computer name, and we'll give it an empty string. And obviously we will get the same error, but on computer name this time. So that's how you can validate without typecasting. String is an easy one, but there are other ones where it will have an issue with it. But if we keep it like this, we may want validate not null or empty. But if you never want it to be null or empty, it's a good option. Now let's look at our file and destination folder. Now, test and test aren't really the best files. Those aren't really files. Let's say we want a full path. We want file to be a full path. Well, one thing we can do is say validate drive. And here we can say, well, it has to be, let's say we only want to copy on C, and the destination, we can just say we want to only copy on, I should say D, right? So now when we run this again, test and test, what are we gonna get? Well, the path argument drive C does not belong. Oh, this assumes that test is C users Caroline desktop test. Right, so it assumes that. But here, it also, for the second one, it also assumes that it's test. So let's say we're going to call it D for both of them. And see what happens. See, now it will fail in the first one. So it says it's not part of the drive D. Now, if I do D test, and here we'll do D test, now we won't have any problem except the computer, obviously. So that's how you can validate that somebody is giving a proper drive. So there are a few more that you can use, and I'm not gonna necessarily dig deep into all of them. We will see a few more when we go into advanced function. But if you go here in that documentation that I will add to the course resources, the lecture resources, you can see all or a lot of them. But a lot of them also require that you use an advanced function. So in the next lecture, we're going to look at advanced function and dig a little bit deeper into parameter.